Sorry, it's the return of the double act. Can I thank the Noble Lord, Lord Morton, for his excellent explanation of this amendment and also his intention of tabling it. I think that it's difficult whenever you... I mean, if the last group was tricky, then yikes, getting rid of hate crime, it's a bit like, what am I doing here? But anyway, I'm going to carry on regardless and try and unpack why I think this is so important. One thing that I'm very aware of is that the accusation of hate crime or hate speech in any way can really make you stutter and stammer and look the other way. The Noble Lady Baroness Brinton, when she told that story of the abuse that she received and the way that everybody stayed quiet until the incident was over and then rushed up to her, reminded me of what it feels like at the moment to have unpopular views. I mean, very often you're kind of being attacked, and then people will kind of come up to you afterwards and kind of squeeze your arm and say, I did agree with what you said, but they don't say it out loud. There's an awful lot of people who look away because they're frightened that they'll be accused of supporting hate. And the best example that this House has discussed endlessly is the consequences for hundreds, thousands of young women in towns and throughout the land who basically were abused and raped and sexually assaulted because people in official positions, social workers, teachers, people who knew that they were being abused in that way, were frightened that if they complained, they would be accused of Islamophobic, racist hate. And so they were quiet, and the Noble Lady Baroness Casey's report makes that clear, as does all other discussion on that question. So in other words, it's difficult, this one, but we've got to keep going. What is a hate crime? For the purposes of legislators, Lord Sumption already quoted, but he explains it this way. He said the Crown Prosecution Service and the police have agreed to define a hate crime as anything which is perceived by the victim or anyone else to be motivated by hostility or prejudice. In other words, the definition which they use is subjective. If the complainant thinks it's a hate crime, then it's a hate crime. That is extraordinarily dangerous, as it inevitably makes denying the charge of saying, I'm not a hate criminal, that's not hate crime, what I've just said, you've got no defence, but it empowers a complainant as a victim who can't be challenged. This, and it's been proven to be the case, is incredibly divisive in society. It incites people, in fact, to adopt a victim label, and in a period of identity politics and protected characteristic, it undermines equality before the law, which, in reference to something else that the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton said, in the 1980s, as somebody active in anti-racist politics throughout that time, it was to have equality before the law rather than discrimination, and was actually not an argument so much focusing on words, but on making sure that people were treated equally, not spoken to nice in different terms. Although that was a bit of an argument, that was never something that was demanded by those of us involved in those fights. Ironically, for the aim of hate speech laws for many people is to create a kinder society, a nicer society. But as the Noble Lady Baroness Chakrabarti, who's not in her place, reminded us in second reading, and I'm paraphrasing here, she said, certain legislation in the early 90s raised public expectations that governments could legislate their way to a harmonious society, eradicate an emotion like hate. And indeed, it's a theme that the Economist feature I mentioned earlier picks up. It said, the aim of hate speech laws is to promote social harmony, yet there's scant evidence they work. Suppressing speech with the threat of prosecution appears to foster division. When the law forbids giving offence, it creates an incentive for people to claim to be offended, thereby using the police to silence a critic or settle a score with a neighbour. When some groups are protected by hate speech laws, others demand protection too. Thus, the effort to stamp out hurtful words can create a taboo ratchet with more and more areas deemed off limits. And before long, this hampers public debate. It's hard to have an open, frank exchange about controversial issues like immigration, say, if one side fears that expressing its views will invite a visit from the police. And that's really what this amendment's getting at, which is removing hate crime is not going from the statute books, does not mean that we're going to live in a hateful society. Hate crime on the statute books encourages people actually to be divisively, toxically antagonistic to each other. Next, on aggravated offences, the idea that you get a longer sentence if it's alleged that you're motivated by hate, and the concept of stirring up hate. Removing specific acts that are crimes and removing specific acts that are crimes from thoughts or speech, or the speech behind them, I think conflates dangerously speech and action. And when hate crime laws require that the authorities infer a perpetrator's belief and assigns greater punishment based on ideological motive, I think it can lead to some very perverse criminal justice outcomes which matter to legislators. In the CPS's recent report on recent hate crime prosecutions, there was a telling, shocking example. A man was put in jail for 20 weeks for, quote, assaulting his father's sister and a police officer and using racist slurs against his sister's partner. Actually, 20 weeks seemed a bit low to me as it goes. But anyway, then the detail was revealed. The CPS explains that actually, for assaulting his father's sister and a police officer, the person who was found guilty received a community order. They received the 20 weeks in prison for the racist slur. So for the assault, you can retain your freedom, but for the racist words, you get 20 weeks in jail. Isn't that confusing? There are endless examples I could cite. But I think that it's no wonder then that particularly young people, rather than actually being super sensitive, as was described earlier, are actually super sensitive to words they find difficult, and they actually think speech is violence and can't distinguish between physical threats, physical harm, and what they imagine to be harmful speech, which in turn justifies using physical violence against hate speech they hear, which was brutally illustrated, I think, by Charlie Kirk's assassination. Somebody whose politics I didn't agree with, but who basically was seen to be a hate criminal, and if all speech is violence, then basically you can use violence back. I think these are regressive cultural fruits of vaguely drafted laws that give a vast and subjective discretion, and I think it is adding to the atmosphere of toxicity and cancel culture. I know that, just to finish off, I know that all roads lead back to the noble Lord MacDonald's River Glaven's review. But I really would actually ask the noble Lord the Minister if he can explain what's the point of the review if, when he's looking at the provisions such as public order offences and some of these issues, and I know he's somebody who's very concerned about free speech, if we're going to just say that the status quo works. I think that hate crime legislation is getting us in a mess. The noble Lord says absolutely disagrees. But actually, the government has asked for a review of these very ideas. Surely the noble Lord, the Minister, might be open-minded to that review, if not to the noble Lord, Lord Moynihan or myself or other people who've spoken. So might there be some flexibility from the noble Lord, the Minister, in thinking that possibly, just possibly, legislators before this government brought in some bad laws, that at the very least we should look at them again, and that maybe, just maybe, hate crime legislation is making society more hateful, young people more anxious and frightened, and actually is bad for democracy.